Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Marjorie Nathanson, the Executive Director of the Hunterdon Art Museum. Thank you so much for being here. We're so happy to be here with Hetty Baiz tonight to hear her presentation on the occasion of her exhibition. I'd like to thank the museum's major funders, the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, a partner agency of the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. There'll be time for questions after Hetty finishes her talk. So if you do have a question, please type it into the chat at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to it before we close. One of Hunterdon Art Museum's great traditions is our annual members exhibition. From September to January, we get to showcase the work of our members. A juror makes the selections from the many entries that we receive. And from those selections, the juror chooses one person for a solo exhibition, the museum's member highlight exhibition. It was Mitra Abaspour, Princeton University's Haskell Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, who chose Hetty Baiz, and we are so glad that she did. The portraits that Hetty produces are so beautiful and haunting, and it's been a really lovely experience to have them in the galleries for the last few weeks. Hetty Baiz has a BFA from Cornell University. Her work has been in numerous solo and group exhibitions, both nationally and internationally. She has taken part in collaborative art projects in China, Tibet, Dubai, Australia, and France. And it is my pleasure to introduce Hetty Baiz. Hetty?
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. All right. And hello, everyone. I'm getting the technology down here and we're ready to go. Thank you very much, Marjorie. And thank you everyone for coming to this presentation. I really appreciate it. I've been painting pretty much all of my life. My first teacher and perhaps strongest influence in my artistic development was my mother, Hetty Baiz, herself an artist. As I was growing up, my mother would take a 5-hour bus ride every week to New York City from our rather provincial town of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, to Hans Hofmann's school on 8th Street in New York to study painting. Hofmann is celebrated for his exuberant, color-filled canvases and renowned as an influential teacher for generations of artists, particularly the abstract expressionism. His teaching had a huge influence on my mother's own work pictured here. As a young child, I remember loving the wild colors and brushstrokes on the paintings she would unveil upon returning from New York. I would always say, "Oh, Mommy, I love them, they're beautiful." My father, who was open-minded but more conservative, would comment, "I will have to live with them before I can judge." She encouraged me to be free when I created, to squeeze a lot of paint onto the palette and use big brushes and palette knives, to move color around the canvas and create a sense of space, of push and pull with strong, vibrant color and form. Our cottage in northeastern Pennsylvania, where we spent summers, became a gallery of her work with one of her paintings pictured here. And she filled the entire house with vibrant colors. For me, it was like growing up inside of a work of art. Her influence led me to major in art in college. First at Bard College, pictured here with my painting class, where I studied with Murray Reich and Jim Sullivan, and a subsequent summer fellowship to Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine, where I worked with Jacob Lawrence, James Weeks, and Robert Goodnow. At Cornell, I continued to pursue my passion for abstract expressionism, studying with color field painter Friedel Zubis. I was also introduced to the figure by Gillian Peterson Craig through a life drawing class I took with her. And this tapped into a whole new sensibility for me, the mystery of the human body. It struck a deep chord within that subsequently came out years later, I feel, in my figures and faces, the latter of which are in view at the Hunterdon Art Museum today. I moved to New York in the mid-20s, when I was in my mid-20s, and shared a loft with my husband's sculptor, Jim Perry, on West 26th Street. I continued working in oil and producing abstract expressionist works. Having children led my husband, pictured here with our son, led us to think about leaving our loft on 26th Street. The neighborhood at the time was extremely dangerous, and a cab driver, when dropping me off one evening, said, "Oh, you live next to the biggest drug trafficking parking lot in the city," which I was totally unaware of. So we finally decided that we needed to exit to a safer place. But I also wanted to point out in this picture that a garbage can makes a great way to show your work. It adds, I think, to the cachet. We settled in Princeton, New Jersey, and I was subsequently invited to join a regional group of artists, the Princeton Artists Alliance, and my work started to shift. We focused on group shows around themes, and one of the first projects I became involved in with the group was to respond to Robert Fagel's translation of the Odyssey. After reading it, I selected the scene where Odysseus, upon returning home after a 20-year voyage, finds his house filled with men pursuing his wife in hopes of taking over the kingdom. The suitors had young women lovers, and in revenge, he takes the young women and hangs them. This was such a visceral scene that I knew that I had to respond. I started by painting my own body, pressing tissue paper on it, tearing the tissue into pieces, collaging and painting on it. This is a large piece about 6 feet high. I created the first of what was to become a series of body print paintings of figures over a 10-year period. This is to show the scale. That's at an installation at the Corcoran School of Art in Washington. I added writing and paint and drawing and plaster and old linoleum floor tiles and burning in the process of creating these pieces. This is a close-up detail of that piece. And another detail of that piece. Over the years, I had started collecting paper from various travels and other countries, and a friend had given me a lot of really beautiful handmade Japanese paper. I came across a book on animals one day, and I was struck by many of them, their color, their form, even the personality of these particular animals. And I decided to experiment and create animals from torn pieces of paper that I had collected. This started me creating a series of some 40 very large paintings of animals over a 5-year period. This large butterfly is part of the Penn Medicine collection in Princeton. The fish is also about 6 feet long and in the same collection. This detail shows up close my process. For me, painting these animals was a kind of observational painting in which, well, where the figures were, I threw my whole body into the piece, literally. Now I'm stepping back and observing. And for me, it's a form of painting in which I looked closely at images of animals as models. But instead of using paint, I would hand tear thousands of pieces of paper that I had collected to create the final animal form and the color tones that I was observing. This rhino is about 7 feet long and in a private collection in Princeton. The owners have affectionately named this piece Rembrandt. The cow is about 86 inches long and is in a private collection in LA. When I made this piece, I researched this is a detail, I researched the history of cattle-like animals and found ancient cave paintings and hieroglyphics that I printed out on my printer and then tore and incorporated into the body of the cow, along with other writing and marks. The animal series culminated in a solo exhibit at Princeton University, curated by Kate Summers, and in conjunction with a symposium on animal rights led by ethicist Peter Singer. So for this exhibit, his book, Animal Liberation, which I read, I created the animals that he wrote about that were either factory farmed or eaten factory farm for food or used as test animals in labs. And Peter Singer's favorite animal in the entire show was the rat, which I affectionately call Ratty. Trips to South Africa during this time period gave me new sources of inspiration. For around 5 years and over a 5-year period, I volunteered as an art instructor at an NGO and taught art to women in the underserved communities outside of Cape Town, South Africa. In this capacity, I had the privilege of working beside women weavers and became really inspired by their process and work. Upon returning home, I built a small loom and began experimenting to see what I could do and how I might incorporate weaving into my work. After about a year of trial and error, nothing really seemed to be working or clicking. But then one day, I came across old snapshots at our summer cottage. Some of the people known, many unknown. And I asked myself, what would happen if I tried my hand at weaving faces? As a longtime practitioner of Zen meditation, one particular koan or a question seemed to stick in my mind and resonate with me as I began to look at these faces. And the koan goes, there is a true person of no rank that is always coming and going from the face of each of us. Look, look. I started weaving faces and made small pieces as experiments to see what would happen. Like meditation, weaving is a repetitive process, a form of meditation, in and out as the breath. I intentionally create ambiguous portraits and am drawn to the transitory, obscure, undefined, changing. It's this experience that I felt a strong need to express in my work. To bring from the inside to the outside, to make the formless within into form without as a work of art. Evolving, devolving, coming, or going. Who is this person of no rank? I moved from smaller pieces to larger pieces. My larger pieces are created by hand weaving printed paper and jute into small squares that, when assembled into a grid on canvas, form the total image. This is a detail of that piece. Oil pastel, ink, paint, gold leaf, and other materials are rubbed or splattered onto the surface, further obscuring the subject and emphasizing the heavily textured physical properties of the object. The faces appear to be fading into the rugged surface, or are they emerging from it? Evolving or devolving? The identity of the subject is absorbed into the materiality. They appear to be asking open-ended questions about transience and the nature of being, posed as material in the form of a face. The original face emerging in a sea of open possibilities. It was from this recent series of faces that my work was selected by Mitra Abspor for a solo exhibit at the Hunterdon Art Museum. I'd like to take you to that exhibit now. This is a detail of that piece. On the right is a detail of the larger piece on the left. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mitra. Thank you, Marjorie, and the staff at the museum.
Hey, thank you for a lovely talk. It's fascinating to see your journey from abstraction to the portraits, and it strikes me that within those portraits, the abstraction still exists. I don't know if you care to comment on that at all.
Yes, actually, you're absolutely right. And I mean, the weaving of the portraits is a very meditative, methodical process, very quiet process for me. And once the weaving is done, I assemble the pieces on the grid and on the canvas. I almost shift into a completely different mode where I start attacking the canvas. It's not attacking it, but where I just take paint and I take oil pastels and I take gold leaf and I start really working it as an abstract piece. I'm just looking at the color and the form and the aesthetic qualities of the piece. And I often have so much oil. I've often worked so much on a piece of so much oil pastel that I completely obliterate the image. So it's a completely different process, but it's a nice balance for me.
The results are beautiful. So
Thank you.
Do you want to talk at all about what's got upcoming, what you're working on?
Yes. So some of these portraits are going to be in an exhibit in Washington, D.C. at the Susan Calloway Gallery, starting May 14th through June 11th with an artist, a British artist, Lindsay Mullen, and she does very amorphous Turneresque landscapes. So we're matching those two pieces together. And then in the fall, I'm in a Skowhegan showcase, a series of 5 exhibits. I'm in an exhibit with Jason Seabury at their New York space. That's coming up in October. And then January, I'll be having a show with Laura Durwald at the Arts Council in Princeton. So there is a lot going on.
There's a question, and the question's actually from Mitra Abispur. And she'd like to know, she's saying, among the reasons I was interested in your work was the way these works combine processes of painting, photography, and weaving textile. Would you speak to the ways you think about these processes meeting in your work and informing one another?
So I start with the photograph. I find a face that resonates with me. And the interesting part for me is to take that photograph, which I scan and edit, and to start cutting it up. In other words, I'm almost destroying it. I'm cutting it up into strips. So I'm leaving that intact photograph. And as I weave, I'm not really thinking too much aesthetically about what's happening. It's more of a mechanical process. And as the result, at the end of the weaving, I see what evolves. When I have the individual pieces, I don't even see the image any longer of the face. It disappears, which is also a very interesting process. And once the weaving pieces are adhered to the canvas, I feel sometimes that the face is too clear. It becomes clear again. And I want to take it back to that amorphous state, which is where I start painting to help me not dissolve the image, but to make it become more diffused. So it's a step-by-step process, the photograph first, the weaving, and the painting. But in the end, I want it to all be an integrated whole. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. There's another question and a comment from Leslie Danoff, who asks, do the faces appear after you have assembled your weavings, or do you have an idea of the portrait as you're weaving? I love your work. Hope to see you and your work sometime soon. So happy to watch a retrospective of your work.
Thank you, Leslie. I start with a clear picture, but then the picture, as I may have mentioned, disappears. So when I'm weaving, I'm not seeing the face at all. I'm just seeing color and weaving and jute. So the jute is a very rough material, and it's it's actually kind of full of threads. So as I'm weaving, I'm just seeing color. I'm not really seeing the face, and I'm not trying to make it into a face. When I put them all together, then I start seeing the face coming out again. Then I paint on top and the face starts disappearing.
Great.
And I hope to see you too, Leslie.
And I hope to see everybody who's watching at the museum. I just want to remind you that there are just a few more days to see Hetty's beautiful show. It closes on Sunday. And so come on by and see it if you haven't already. I want to thank you all again for being here with us tonight. And Hetty, thank you so much for doing this and for letting us see all of your work that from the beginning to now. So we thank you so much. So good night, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, everyone.